In 1953, on a low gravel terrace above the south shore of Lake Butte des Mortes, in Algoma Township, Winnebago County, Wisconsin, a landowner named M.C. Reigh watched heavy equipment cut into ground he had farmed for years and come back up carrying something that was not gravel. The machinery had been brought in to strip sand and stone from the terrace, ordinary commercial work repeated on shorelines across the Fox River Valley that decade, feeding the region's hunger for road fill and construction aggregate. What came up instead, mixed into the load, was bone, and clinging to some of it, a crust of green corrosion that did not belong to any farm tool lost in the soil within living memory. Reigh's land had given small signs of this before. People along that shoreline had reported odd finds since at least the 1890s, a scrap of green metal turned up once and forgotten, never followed by anyone with the training to ask what it meant. For 60 years the ground kept its own record, and nobody came to read it. What the crew was looking at, once the equipment shut down and the men climbed down to examine the load, was not a single object, but a scatter, bone fragments mixed through sand and gravel the way anything is mixed through sand and gravel once heavy machinery has already passed over it once. The green crust on the metal pieces was not paint, and it was not rust in any form the men would have recognized from their own tools. It was patina, copper reacting slowly with soil and moisture, across a span of time none of them had any way to estimate standing there in the cut. In 1953, the machine finally forced the question. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The terrace Reigh farmed sat inside what the Milwaukee Public Museum's own collection records would later identify as the densest concentration of a particular kind of prehistoric material anywhere in the state. The stretch of east-central Wisconsin gathered around Lake Winnebago, and the chain of smaller lakes the Fox River threads together on its way north to Green Bay. That density was not a discovery made in 1953. It had been building in the record for 80 years already, mostly in the form of individual reports scattered across farm ledgers, county historical society newsletters, and the private collections of men who kept what they found in cigar boxes on a shelf. As early as the final decades of the 1800s, farmers working plowed fields from Manitowoc County to the Fox River Valley had been turning up hammered copper tools with a regularity that eventually drew the attention of antiquarians willing to travel from farm to farm, asking to see what had been kept. The Wisconsin Archaeological Society, founded in the 1900s, spent its early decades doing exactly that kind of legwork, and its journal from those years reads less like a scholarly publication than a running ledger of individual encounters between plow blades and objects nobody expected to find. In one representative entry from a volume published around 1908, the Society recorded that a set of stone platform pipes had been turned up years earlier by a farmer named L. Craigs, plowing his own land in Section 30 of Eagle Township, Richland County, the flange of one pipe's bowl broken clean off by the blade that exposed it. Nothing in the published note suggests anyone from the Society ever traveled to see the field itself. The pipes were described, sketched, catalogued in a paragraph, and the record moved on to the next report. Multiply that single paragraph by several hundred, spread across 6 decades and dozens of counties, and the shape of the state's early archaeological record starts to come into focus. Not a body of excavated sites, but a body of second-hand testimony from working farmers, recorded by a small society with neither the staff nor the funding to verify most of what it was told. By 1904, one antiquarian working that same terrain, P.V. Lawson of Menasha, had assembled the most complete inventory anyone had yet attempted of the state's copper material specifically. Brown, who edited and contributed to the Society's journal across the following decades, published Lawson's tally that same year and put the number at slightly more than 13,000 individual pieces already accounted for, drawn almost entirely from surface finds and plowed ground rather than from any excavated grave. Brown noted something else in that same report, almost in passing. The true number, he wrote, would have been considerably higher had early pioneers not melted down a share of this valuable metal to forge new tools of their own. That detail matters more than it first appears to. It means the largest single gap in this record was never a missing document or a sealed file. It was copper that went back into a furnace and came out as a hinge, a kettle patch, a horseshoe, indistinguishable afterward from any other piece of scrap metal, sitting in a barn or a toolbox walking distance from the field where it had first been hammered into shape thousands of years earlier. What Reigh's equipment operator was looking at, once the crew stopped to examine the material coming up with the gravel, belonged to a category archaeologists by then were calling the Old Copper Complex, a name assigned not for lack of a better one, but because the copper itself was the clearest and most durable signature its makers had left behind. The material is native copper, mined and gathered from outcrops and glacial float around Lake Superior's Keweenaw Peninsula, typically running above 95% pure, carried south in places as far as southern Illinois by the same Pleistocene glaciers that scoured the copper loose from bedrock in the first place. Ancient mining pits documented decades later at sites like Macago's Cove on Isle Royale show that some of this material was also dug directly, not simply gathered as float, by people working the same outcrops that 19th century American mining companies would eventually reopen with blasting powder and steam hoists. Nobody in the old copper tradition smelted the metal. There is no evidence anywhere in this record of ore reduction by heat, no slag deposits, no furnace remains, nothing resembling the metallurgical process that would eventually define the Bronze Age on the far side of the world. Instead, the makers worked the metal cold, hammering it into shape with stone tools, then heating it just enough to soften the crystal structure before hammering again, a cycle known as annealing that allows a metal to be drawn and flattened far beyond what cold hammering alone would permit before the material splits or crumbles. The result, examined today in institutional collections that now include more than 1,500 individual pieces at the Milwaukee Public Museum alone, plus several hundred more pieces at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison, the Field Museum in Chicago, the Neville Public Museum in Green Bay, and university collections farther afield, spans axes, adzes, socketed spear points in several distinct profiles, knives, awls, fishhooks, harpoons, crescents, spuds, beads, and bracelets. Profiles. What came out of the Reigh terrace matched this range closely: copper projectile points, knives and axes, strings of copper beads, and a copper ornament shaped, distinctly, like a feather, an object with no clear practical use at all beyond the fact that someone with real skill had chosen to make it. The age of this material is not a matter of guesswork dressed up as science. In March of 2021, a study built around a copper projectile point recovered from the shore of Eagle Lake in Wisconsin, examined by archaeologist Michelle Beber of Kent State University, placed the object at roughly 8,500 years old, a conical point 10 centimeters long, hammered from pure copper by hunter-gatherers who had no pottery, no agriculture, and by any conventional model of technological development, no obvious reason to have developed metalworking at all. That study, and related work by Beber and her colleague Metin Eren, examining why the tradition later declined in volume, even as the underlying skill clearly persisted, concluded that old copper metalworking emerged, and eventually faded in prominence, considerably earlier and on a considerably different timeline than archaeologists had assumed for most of the 20th century. The dating problem at the Reigh site itself worked differently and more slowly. No radiocarbon sample from Reigh produced a clean date the way Eagle Lake's point eventually would. What gave the wider old copper timeline its first hard anchor came from a related site excavated a year earlier, and that site's own story runs in a close, almost mirrored line to what happened on Reigh's land, separated by one county and by exactly 1 year. The crew that responded to what Reigh's machinery had exposed was not local. The Wisconsin Historical Society dispatched Hiroshi Daifuku and Warren Wittry to the site, and they were joined by David Baerreis of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, 3 researchers working a salvage excavation under a condition that shaped everything about how the dig had to run. The gravel operation had not stopped. It could not stop, Not for long, not on a working commercial lease. And so the team worked the exposed burials in the narrow interval available to them, racing ground that was actively being cut away around them, rather than excavating at the careful, deliberate pace a fully protected site would have allowed. What they recovered, in that compressed window, was substantial. Roughly 46 individuals came out of the ground at Reigh, along with the copper goods buried with them, findings written up the following year in the Wisconsin Archaeologist under the authorship of Baerreis, Daifuku, and James Lundstedt, a paper that remains the fullest account of the site's burial complex ever published. The report closed one chapter of the site's history. It did not close the site itself. In 1956, 3 years after the professional team had finished and moved on, unauthorized diggers, described in later federal records only as avocationals, worked the site again, outside any institutional oversight, disturbing what remained and taking or displacing material nobody has since been able to fully account for. What had been recovered legitimately in 1953 went into 2 separate institutional collections, split between the Wisconsin Historical Society and the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Anthropology, where the human remains sat for the next 61 years. It was not until September of 2014 that a formal, itemized accounting of what those 2 institutions actually held from Reigh appeared anywhere in the public record, in a notice of inventory completion published in the Federal Register under the requirements of federal repatriation law. 60 years passed between the first reported disturbance on that shoreline in the 1890s and any qualified excavation. Another 61 passed between that excavation and any complete public accounting of what it had actually recovered. The gap is not evidence of anyone hiding anything. It is simply what happens when a discovery this size lands on a working commercial gravel lease, gets excavated under deadline pressure by a 3-person team, and is never revisited afterward with the resources a slower, better-funded investigation would have brought to it. What happened on Reigh's land in 1953 was not an isolated event, and the pattern it belongs to becomes clearer once it is set beside the 2 sites that came before it. The first of the 3, chronologically, sits nearly 150 miles to the southwest, on the Mississippi River shoreline, about 2 miles south of the town of Potosi, in Grant County. In May of 1945, 2 local fishermen, Ralph Turner and Victor Irish, came across artifacts eroding directly out of the riverbank at a spot known locally as Osceola Landing, an old steamboat stop from an earlier century of river traffic. They did not have the training to know exactly what they had found, only that it did not look like anything they had seen wash out of that bank before. Word reached Edwin Goke and John Grindell of nearby Platteville, who investigated further and reported the find up the chain, first to the Wisconsin State Historical Museum, then to the Milwaukee Public Museum. Robert Ritzenthaler and John Douglas of the Milwaukee Museum arrived that August, 3 months after the fishermen's initial discovery, to lead what became the first scientific excavation ever conducted at an old copper complex site. 3 months is not a long interval by most standards. On an exposed, eroding riverbank, already known to local collectors, it was long enough. Between May and August, numerous copper artifacts were pulled from the site by people with no connection to any museum or historical society, gone before the professionals ever got a shovel into the ground, never catalogued, never tied to a burial or a stratigraphic layer, simply removed and kept, some of them very likely still sitting in the same houses along that stretch of river today. The excavation that followed still recovered an extraordinary amount, an estimated 500 burials in total, though a sizable share of those had already been disturbed, either by natural erosion working the riverbank over decades, or by the collecting that had gone on in the 3-month gap between discovery and excavation. Because no chipstone or pottery evidence tied to a firmly dated cultural horizon was found in clear association with the burials, and because the preservation of the skeletal material itself was poor, the excavators could only place Osceola in relative terms, sometime in the pre-pottery phase of the region's early prehistory, without a hard number attached. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The second site came 7 years later, in June of 1952, and its discovery involved no professional of any kind. Donald Baldwin was 13 years old, digging in an abandoned gravel quarry on the western outskirts of the city of Oconto, when he turned up human bone. He did what a 13-year-old in a small Wisconsin town in 1952 would reasonably do. He told the local historical society. Reuben Lefebvre, a Wisconsin state senator, and George Hall, founder of the Oconto County Historical Society, followed up on the boys' report, and their preliminary digging revealed burials accompanied by unmistakable old copper material. The Wisconsin Historical Society and the Milwaukee Public Museum, the latter represented again by Robert Ritzenthaler, this time working with Warren Wittry, mounted a full excavation that same year. 45 burials came out of the ground at Oconto, a substantial recovery, and also, by the excavator's own assessment, only a fraction of what the site had likely once held. As many as 200 burials may have existed there originally, the majority destroyed not by looting or erosion, but by ordinary commercial gravel quarrying that had been running on that exact spot through the 1920s, 3 decades before anyone recognized what the operation had been cutting through the whole time. Not everything the Oconto excavators recovered was copper. Buried with a juvenile among the 45 burials was a small musical instrument, a whistle carved from the wing bone of a tundra swan, an object that survives today not because it was made of a durable metal, but because the sand it rested in happened to protect it for more than 5,000 years. What a photograph of that whistle shows, sitting on a museum tray beside the copper awls and spear points recovered from the same ground, is a reminder that the copper is simply the part of this culture's material world that happened to last. Everything made of bone, wood, hide, or fiber that these same people almost certainly also produced is gone, and the copper's survival has shaped, more than anyone excavating in the 1950s might have admitted, which parts of this culture got to be studied at all. The Oconto site's most consequential contribution came the following year, when a charcoal sample recovered during the dig, designated C836, was sent to the University of Chicago's Institute for Nuclear Studies and into the hands of Willard Libby, the physicist who had invented radiocarbon dating only a few years earlier. The result, the first radiocarbon date ever obtained from a prehistoric Wisconsin site, came back at roughly 5,600 years before present, with a margin of about 400 years in either direction. For the first time, the isolated copper tools farmers had been finding in plowed fields since the 1870s had a number attached to them, a real age, arrived at through physics rather than guesswork. 80 years after the first of those tools had already been pulled out of the ground, and long after most of them had passed through hands with no reason to record where they came from. It is worth pausing on how those tools were understood before that number existed, because the earlier explanation offered for them was not a neutral one. For decades, some antiquarians examining the same heavy patina and careful workmanship that marked old copper material speculated that it could not be the product of the region's indigenous population at all, and instead credited it to a vanished, unnamed people, or in some published accounts, to visitors from across the Atlantic, an idea built less on evidence than on an unwillingness to credit Native American communities with a metalworking tradition of this sophistication. Subsequent excavation, including the burial evidence recovered at Osceola, Oconto, and Reigh, along with the skeletal and cultural continuity documented across the wider Upper Great Lakes region, dismantled that theory the same way a parallel investigation, conducted decades earlier by Cyrus Thomas for the Bureau of Ethnology, had already dismantled a nearly identical myth surrounding the mound-building earthworks farther south and east. The Old Copper Complex people were the ancestors of the region's indigenous nations, working ground that includes the ancestral homeland of the Menominee, and the copper they left behind is their record, not an inheritance borrowed from anywhere else. Set next to each other, the 3 sites, Osceola in 1945, Oconto in 1952, and Reigh in 1953 share a structure too consistent to be coincidence and too ordinary to be anything more sinister than the way institutions actually respond to unplanned discoveries. None of the three was found by an archaeologist. Everyone was found by someone doing something else entirely. Fishing, digging as a bored kid in a quarry, running gravel equipment on a working farm. In every case, a private individual or a local historical society acted as the necessary intermediary. The person or institution that recognized the find was worth reporting to a state-level museum, rather than simply keeping or selling it. And in every case, the interval between discovery and qualified excavation, whether it ran 3 months, a matter of weeks, or an unrecorded stretch of days, was wide enough for material to be pulled from the ground by people with no obligation to record where it came from. The professionals, when they did arrive, consistently arrived to a site already partially compromised, working against an active threat, be it a river current, a running gravel operation, or a quarry crew, with no reason to pause for anyone. What survived to reach a museum shelf at Osceola, Oconto, or Reigh represents what was left after that narrow window closed, not the full picture of what any of those 3 sites had actually contained before it did. The scale of what never made it into that narrower, better documented record is the part of this story that is easiest to underestimate. Lawson's 1904 tally of 13,000 pieces did not stop growing after that year. Surface finds continued turning up in plowed fields across the state well into the 20th century, and workshop sites where partially finished and broken copper tools accumulated in quantity, evidence of manufacture rather than burial, were identified at 2 rivers in Manitowoc County, at 4 separate locations along the Fox River in Marquette County, on the Black River south of Sheboygan, at several sites in Waupaca County, and along Green Bay in Oconto and Brown counties, with the pattern of discovery continuing north into Oneida, Vilas, Lincoln, Price, and Forest counties from the 1960s onward. Almost none of this material came from a controlled excavation with a documented burial context. It came from a farmer's field, a plow blade, a shovel meant for something else, and it entered the record the same way Lawson's original catalogue had been built, one report at a time, from people with no formal training and no obligation to notify anyone beyond a neighbor or a local newspaper. The 3 cemetery sites that eventually gave this material a chronology, a technology, and a culture attached to it, Osceola, Oconto, and Reigh, account for a comparatively small fraction of everything that had already surfaced across the state by the time any of them was excavated. The rest sits, to the extent it survives at all, in collections built by private individuals across those same decades, men whose names appear in old exhibit lists and society newsletters and almost nowhere else, some of whose holdings eventually reached institutions and some of which almost certainly did not. Indistinguishable now from ordinary heirlooms in houses where nobody remaining knows what they actually are or where, exactly, on a family farm, they were first turned up by a plow. The copper itself has kept giving up information long after the last of the 3 excavations closed. Researchers working decades after Reigh, Oconto, and Osceola were dug have gone back to the surviving material with a technique called laser ablation, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, a method capable of reading the trace element signature locked inside a piece of worked copper the same way a fingerprint identifies a person, tying a finished tool back to the specific outcrop or float deposit its raw material came from. Applied to old copper material from Reigh, alongside artifacts from sites farther north in Wisconsin's Northern Lakes region, the technique has shown measurable differences in how each community acquired its raw copper, evidence of real barriers to exchange between the people burying their dead on the shore of Lake Butte des Mortes and their contemporaries working the forests and lakes closer to the Superior Basin itself. None of this required a new excavation. It required only that someone return to material already sitting in a drawer at a university or a museum with an instrument nobody had access to in 1953, and ask it a question the original excavators had no way of asking. The distribution of this copper, once researchers began mapping it seriously, turned out to reach far past the borders of Wisconsin. Burial patterns and artifact styles at the Oconto cemetery closely resemble material recovered from the Brewerton and Frontenac burial sites in New York State, a resemblance Brown had already noted in his 1904 report, decades before anyone could explain how two communities separated by hundreds of miles of forest and open water had ended up burying their dead with such similar objects. Comparable artifact types have since turned up as far north and west as Manitoba and Ontario, evidence of a network of contact and exchange that moved not just finished tools but apparently the knowledge of how to make them, carried on foot and by canoe across a landscape with no roads, no draft animals, and no written record of any of the routes involved. The copper feather found at Reigh, the whistle found at Oconto, and the still uncatalogued fraction of Lawson's 13,000 pieces scattered through farmhouses and county collections all belong to a single technological and cultural horizon that once ran from the shore of Lake Superior to the Atlantic seaboard, sustained for millennia by people modern archaeology only began taking seriously within the last 100 years. What all of this requires, if the physical evidence is taken on its own terms, is a considerable revision of how early sophisticated metalworking is presumed to have appeared in the Americas. A hunter-gatherer population living around the Great Lakes was hammering and annealing pure copper into finished tools and ornaments by at least 8,500 years ago, a technology arrived at independently, with no contact with any other metalworking tradition on the planet. No agriculture to anchor a settled population, and in the case of the Reigh site's copper feather ornament, enough surplus skill and time to produce objects that served no clearly utilitarian purpose at all. That technology did not spread into a larger metallurgical tradition the way it eventually did elsewhere in the world. It appeared, persisted for several thousand years across a landscape now covered by Wisconsin, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and neighboring parts of the western Great Lakes, and then, gradually, stopped being made in anything like the same volume, for reasons researchers are still actively working to explain, rather than reasons anyone has settled on with confidence. What does survive is scattered across the collections of a dozen institutions, weighed against an unknown quantity that never reached any collection at all. Some of it melted for scrap before anyone thought to ask what it had been. Some of it still sitting, unrecognized, in a drawer or a cigar box somewhere in eastern Wisconsin, waiting on nothing more than someone deciding to ask an old family a few more questions about where a green-crusted piece of metal on a shelf actually came from. The three sites did not end up in the same condition, and that difference is its own kind of record. The ground Donald Baldwin was digging in as a boy in 1952 is now Copper Culture State Park, 42 acres set aside by the state specifically because of what he found there, with a marker at the burial ground explaining to visitors what the old copper people were doing on that spot roughly 4,500 years ago. No burials, excavations, or exhibits remain visible on the ground itself, but the site is protected, named, and open to the public every year. The Osceola Riverbank has no equivalent designation, its exposure having been a matter of erosion rather than ownership, subject to the same current that exposed it in the first place, and could just as easily rework the bank again. The Reigh Terrace has neither a park nor a marker of any kind. It is private farmland today, the same use it was in 1953, distinguished from any other stretch of shoreline along that lake by nothing visible to anyone driving past. Its history preserved only in a 1954 journal article, a handful of institutional accession numbers, and a federal inventory notice filed 61 years after the fact. The terrace above Lake Butte des Mortes, where M.C. Reigh's equipment struck bone and green metal in 1953, is still there, though the gravel operation that exposed it is long finished, and the shoreline has settled back into the ordinary business of being farmland and lake frontage. What that ground gave up that year, and what it had been quietly signaling for 60 years before anyone paid attention, was a fragment of a technology that predates the pyramids, predates written language anywhere on the continent, and belongs to people whose descendants are still part of this region today. Working ground that keeps handing back small, corroded pieces of what they built there thousands of years before anyone thought to write any of it down. It surfaced the way almost all of it has surfaced across this part of Wisconsin for a century and a half, by accident, in the path of a plow, a fisherman's boot, or a piece of rented machinery, read by whoever happened to be standing there when the ground finally gave it up. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.